The radio crackled with static at 3:47 hours, then went silent. Major Catherine Kit Blackwood stared at the communications panel in the Tactical Operations Center, her weathered fingers hovering over the frequency dial. Captain Zara Phoenix Reyes had been 3 minutes overdue for her scheduled check-in from the contested airspace over the Kandahar Valley. In the unforgiving arithmetic of combat aviation, 3 minutes might as well have been 3 hours. Ghost Rider 2, this is Eagle's Nest, radio check over. Blackwood's voice carried the controlled tension of someone who had lost too many pilots to hope for miracles. The speakers hissed back with nothing but the hollow whisper of electromagnetic void. She tried again, adjusting frequencies, her eyes scanning the radar screen where Phoenix's transponder had vanished like a dying star. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, call sign Ghost Rider 2, had been conducting close air support for a Marine rifle company pinned down by insurgent positions in the rocky terrain. Phoenix had been flying low and slow, the way Warthog drivers always did, her twin General Electric turbofans singing their distinctive whine as she hunted Taliban fighters who had turned the valley into a killing field. The last transmission had been routine. Eagle's Nest, Ghost Rider 2, Winchester on Hellfires, RTB in 10 minutes. Now the valley had swallowed her whole. Blackwood pushed back from the radio console, her jaw tight. Around the TOC, other personnel continued their tasks with studied professionalism, but she caught the sideways glances, the subtle shift in body language that accompanied bad news spreading through the ranks like smoke. Everyone knew Phoenix, the scrappy kid from East LA who had clawed her way through flight school despite the whispers, the doubts, the barely concealed resentment from some of her male counterparts who still believed women had no business in the cockpit of a ground attack aircraft. "Ma'am," Staff Sergeant Morrison approached with a steaming cup of coffee and a clipboard thick with status reports. "SAR is spinning up. We'll have Pedro's in the air in 20 minutes. Blackwood accepted the coffee but didn't drink it. Through the TOC's reinforced windows, she could see the pre-dawn darkness beginning to soften at the edges, painting the Afghan mountains in shades of gunmetal and shadow. Somewhere out there, Phoenix was either dead or fighting for her life. The distinction mattered less than the fact that one of her pilots had vanished into the same hostile territory that had been claiming aircraft and aircrew for over 2 decades. "Get me Colonel Hayes," she said quietly. "We're going to need more than rescue birds for this one." The morning sun climbed higher, indifferent to human struggles far below. In the valley, something moved among the rocks, something that shouldn't have been there. Something that was very much alive and very, very angry. Captain Zara Reyes had earned her call sign Phoenix, not through some dramatic combat action or memorable training incident, but through the grinding persistence that had defined her entire military career. Born to a single mother in Boyle Heights, she had learned early that respect was something you took, not something given freely. The Air Force had been her escape route from a neighborhood where helicopters usually carried news crews, not rescue teams. She had survived the academy despite instructors who questioned whether she possessed the killer instinct necessary for combat aviation. She had endured flight school where her mistakes were magnified while her successes were dismissed as luck. She had proven herself in countless training exercises, but the doubters remained, whispered conversations that died when she entered the ready room, evaluations that praised her technical skills while questioning her situational awareness under pressure. The irony was not lost on her now, suspended upside down in her ejection seat 50 feet above the valley floor, her parachute tangled in the skeletal remains of a dead tree. Blood dripped from a gash on her forehead, each drop falling with metronomic precision onto the rocky ground below. Her survival radio was damaged. Its antenna snapped off during the violent ejection sequence that had saved her life, when her aircraft's right engine had ingested what felt like half the Taliban's small arms fire. The A-10 had been designed to absorb punishment, its titanium bathtub protecting the pilot from ground fire that would have shredded lesser aircraft. But even the venerable Warthog had its limits, and Phoenix had found them at 800 feet above hostile territory, her hydraulics failing, her right engine trailing smoke and flame, enemy tracers lighting up the dawn sky like malevolent fireflies. She had held the aircraft together long enough to deliver her remaining ordnance on target, watching through her targeting pod as her 30 cannon rounds chewed through the insurgent positions that had been decimating the Marine patrol below. The GAU-8 Avenger had spoken its 7-barreled song of destruction, each trigger pull sending depleted uranium rounds downrange at 4,200 rounds per minute. The enemy positions had simply ceased to exist, erased by the most effective close support weapon ever mounted on a military aircraft. Only then had she pulled the ejection handles. Now, hanging like a broken marionette in the morning heat, Phoenix assessed her situation with the methodical calm that had carried her through a dozen combat deployments. Her left ankle was probably sprained, twisted during the parachute landing that had slammed her into the cliff face. Her survival kit was intact, secured to her harness, containing water purification tablets, a compass, emergency rations, and a .45 caliber pistol that seemed pitifully inadequate against the AK-47s, and RPGs she could hear echoing through the valley. The voices were getting closer, guttural Pashto mixed with Arabic, the linguistic signature of foreign fighters who had crossed the border to wage their holy war. They were hunting for her, following the obvious trail left by her parachute descent. In perhaps an hour, they would find her suspended in this tree like some grotesque offering to their vengeful god. Phoenix reached for her survival knife and began cutting parachute cord. She had work to do. The search and rescue operation launched at first light with the mechanical precision that defined American military efficiency. 2 HH-60 Pave Hawks lifted off from Bagram Air Base, their crews bristling with the specialized equipment needed to extract downed airmen from hostile territory. Pararescue jumpers, the legendary PJs, checked their gear one final time as the helicopters thundered eastward toward the last known position of Ghost Rider 2. Major Blackwood monitored the operation from the TOC, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had long since gone cold. The satellite imagery showed Phoenix's ejection seat hanging from a cliffside tree, but there was no sign of the pilot herself. That could mean she had successfully evaded capture, or it could mean something far worse. In this business, uncertainty was often more corrosive than bad news. Eagle's Nest, this is Pedro 1, crackled the voice of Captain Jake Diesel Morrison, the lead Pave Hawk pilot. We're 5 minutes out from the coordinates. Negative visual on the package so far. The package was military euphemism for Phoenix, reducing a flesh-and-blood pilot to cargo terminology that made the clinical aspects of combat rescue easier to bear. Blackwood understood the psychology behind it. Emotional distance was survival in a profession where getting too attached to people could paralyze decision-making when seconds counted. Pedro 1, Eagle's Nest. Be advised we're tracking multiple hostile elements converging on your area. Time on station is limited. Roger that, Eagle's Nest. We'll make it quick. The Pave Hawks were flying nap of the earth, their pilots using every fold in the terrain to mask their approach. Above them, F-16 Fighting Falcons maintained high cover, ready to rain down precision-guided munitions on anyone who threatened the rescue birds. It was a coordinated ballet of violence and mercy, the full spectrum of American military power focused on retrieving one missing pilot. But Phoenix was no longer at the extraction point. She had spent the previous hour methodically working her way down from the tree, using her survival training to evade the Taliban search parties that were sweeping through the valley like packs of wolves. Her ankle throbbed with each step, but pain was irrelevant now. Movement was life. Stillness was death. She had stripped her flight suit of anything reflective, smeared her face and hands with mud, and began the careful process of moving toward the valley floor where she hoped to find better concealment among the scattered boulders and dry creek beds. The enemy voices seemed to come from all directions, echoing off the canyon walls in a disorienting acoustic maze that made it impossible to pinpoint their exact locations. Her survival radio remained silent, its damaged circuitry as dead as the tree that had arrested her parachute descent. She was alone in enemy territory with no way to communicate her position to the rescue forces she knew were coming. In the distance, she could hear the distinctive thrum of helicopter rotors, growing louder by the minute. Phoenix pressed herself against a sun-warmed boulder and keyed her damaged radio one more time, hopping against hope that something might get through the static and interference. Any station, this is Ghost Rider 2. I'm alive and evading. Grid coordinates. She rattled off her approximate position, knowing the transmission was probably worthless but unwilling to surrender without trying every option. The helicopter's sound was almost directly overhead now, and she risked a glance skyward to see the olive-drab shape of a pave hawk silhouetted against the cloudless blue. So close, yet impossibly far away. Then the shooting started. The Taliban had been waiting for the rescue helicopters, using Phoenix as bait to draw American aircraft into a carefully prepared ambush. Rocket-propelled grenades streaked upward from concealed positions, their smoky trails crisscrossing the morning sky like deadly fireworks. The Pave Hawks broke formation immediately, their pilots throwing the heavy helicopters into violent, evasive maneuvers that would have been impossible in any other aircraft. Pedro 1 taking fire from multiple positions. We're going defensive. The radio channels erupted with the controlled chaos of combat operations. F-16s dove from their high perches, their pilots acquiring targets through targeting pods and releasing precision-guided bombs onto the enemy positions below. The valley floor erupted in geysers of rock and flame as 500-pound JDAMs found their marks with surgical accuracy. Phoenix hugged the ground as shrapnel whistled overhead, watching her would-be rescuers fight for their lives in the sky above. One of the Pave Hawks was trailing smoke from its tail rotor, its pilot struggling to maintain controlled flight, while his door gunners returned fire with M134 miniguns that sounded like chainsaws powered by lightning. She realized with crystal clarity that the rescue attempt was going to fail. The enemy had turned her ejection site into a killing ground, and the helicopters would be forced to withdraw or risk being shot down themselves. The arithmetic of combat was coldly practical. You didn't lose 4 helicopters and 20 aircrew trying to save one pilot, no matter how much that pilot mattered to the people who knew her. But Phoenix had not survived the academy, flight school, and 18 months of combat missions by accepting defeat gracefully. She began moving again, working her way through the boulder field toward what looked like the entrance to a cave system carved into the canyon wall. If she could find shelter and wait for nightfall, she might be able to evade long enough for another rescue attempt under cover of darkness. The sound of pursuing voices grew louder behind her, punctuated by the occasional crack of rifle fire as the Taliban fighters tried to flush her from cover. They were getting closer, their search pattern tightening like a noose around her position. Phoenix checked her survival kit one more time, her fingers finding the cold metal of her service pistol. 7 rounds in the magazine, 1 in the chamber. Not much firepower against an entire valley full of enemy fighters, but it would have to do. She reached the cave entrance just as the first Taliban fighter appeared among the rocks behind her, his AK-47 sweeping back and forth as he searched for movement. Phoenix melted into the shadows of the cave mouth, her heart hammering against her ribs as she waited to see if she had been spotted. The fighter moved past without seeing her, but she knew her luck couldn't last forever. Soon they would organize a systematic search of every cave and crevice in the area. She needed a better plan than simply hiding and hopping for the best. Deep in the cave system, Phoenix made a discovery that changed everything. The caves were not natural formations, but part of an extensive tunnel complex, hand-carved by generations of fighters who had used these mountains as shelter against Soviet forces, Northern Alliance militias, and now American-led coalition troops. The passages ran deep into the mountainside, lit at irregular intervals by primitive oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. Phoenix moved carefully through the tunnels, her survival training warring with the claustrophobic reality of being trapped underground in enemy territory. The air was thick and close, heavy with the smell of human occupation and the acrid smoke of burning oil. Voices echoed from somewhere ahead, Arabic mixed with Pashto, the international language of jihad planning strategy in the bowels of the earth. She paused at a junction where 3 tunnels converged, pressing herself against the stone wall as footsteps approached from the left passage. 2 fighters emerged into the lamplight, their conversation animated and urgent. One of them carried a radio, its antenna extended, and she could hear the crackling of communications between the various search teams scattered throughout the valley above. The fighters passed by without detecting her presence, but their radio chatter provided crucial intelligence. They were coordinating a concentrated sweep of the cave system, working their way systematically through each tunnel and chamber. More importantly, she heard references to a communications center deeper in the complex, a hub where the enemy leadership was coordinating not just her capture, but what sounded like a much larger operation planned for the coming days. Phoenix made a decision that would have seemed insane to anyone not trained in the particular logic of military special operations. Instead of trying to find another way out of the cave system, she began working her way deeper into the complex, following the voices and the gradually improving quality of electric lighting that suggested a more sophisticated setup ahead. The tunnel opened into a natural chamber that had been extensively modified with concrete reinforcements and modern electrical systems. Banks of radio equipment lined the walls, their LED displays casting a green glow over maps covered with tactical markings and photographs of American military installations. Phoenix found herself looking at the nerve center of a major Taliban operation, complete with detailed intelligence about coalition force movements and planned attacks on forward operating bases throughout the province. 3 men occupied the chamber, 2 younger fighters manning the radio equipment, and an older man with a gray beard, who was clearly the senior commander. They were so focused on their planning that they failed to notice the American pilot who had somehow materialized in their most secure facility. Phoenix drew her survival pistol with movements so smooth and quiet that the first indication the Taliban fighters had of her presence was the distinctive sound of a .45 caliber slide being racked to chamber a round. "Nobody move," she said in Arabic, one of the languages she had studied during her intelligence training. "Hands where I can see them." The older commander turned slowly, his eyes widening as he took in the mud-streaked American pilot who had somehow penetrated their underground fortress. For a moment, the chamber was absolutely silent except for the hum of electronic equipment and the distant echo of voices from other parts of the tunnel complex. Then everything went sideways at once. The firefight in the underground communications center lasted exactly 47 seconds and left Phoenix with a bullet graze across her left shoulder, 2 dead Taliban fighters, and 1 very cooperative prisoner who suddenly remembered his English when she pressed the hot barrel of her pistol against his forehead. The older commander, who identified himself as Abdul Rahman, a former Afghan National Army officer who had defected to the Taliban, proved remarkably talkative when presented with the alternative of dying alone in a cave. The intelligence he provided was staggering. Detailed plans for coordinated attacks on 3 coalition bases, supply convoy routes, the locations of weapons caches, and most importantly, the radio frequencies and call signs being used by Taliban units throughout the region. Phoenix forced Rahman to make radio calls canceling the search for the downed American pilot, telling his scattered forces that she had been killed in the initial crash and that they should redeploy to other areas. It was a calculated risk. If they discovered the deception too soon, her situation would become exponentially worse. but it bought her time and reduced the number of enemies actively hunting for her. She spent the next hour systematically destroying the radio equipment and gathering every piece of intelligence material she could carry. Maps, photographs, written orders, radio codes, all of it went into her survival pack, transforming her from a downed pilot into a walking intelligence bonanza that would keep coalition analysts busy for months. The tunnel system had multiple exits, and Raman reluctantly provided directions to the one most likely to get her out of the immediate search area. It emerged on the far side of the mountain, nearly 3 miles from her original crash site, in terrain that the Taliban had apparently not cordoned off as thoroughly as the primary search area. Before leaving, Phoenix made one more radio call on the Taliban command frequency, this time in perfect Pashto that she had learned from an Afghan interpreter during her first deployment. Her message was simple and devastating. She gave away the locations of 6 Taliban safe houses, 3 weapons caches, and the planned timing of the attacks on coalition bases. Then she destroyed the radio and prepared to leave Raman tied up in his ruined command center. "You realize they'll kill you for this," the Taliban commander said as she secured his bonds. "Your own people will never know what you accomplished here." Phoenix looked at him with eyes that held no trace of the uncertainty that had once plagued her career evaluations. "They'll know," she said quietly, "and more importantly, so will you." She left him alive, a decision that would prove more significant than she could have imagined, and began the long journey through the tunnel system toward what she hoped was freedom. Behind her, the electronic heartbeat of Taliban communications had been silenced, creating a dead zone in enemy intelligence that would ripple through their entire operational structure. Above ground, rescue helicopters continued their search patterns, unaware that their missing pilot had just struck the most devastating blow against enemy communications infrastructure in the entire Afghan theater of operations. The sun was approaching its zenith when Phoenix finally emerged from the tunnel system, blinking in the harsh light of the Afghan mountains. The exit was concealed behind a carefully constructed rock fall that had probably taken months to build, invisible from the air and nearly impossible to spot from ground level unless you knew exactly what to look for. She was on the wrong side of the mountain from her original crash site, in a narrow valley that showed no signs of recent Taliban activity. Raman had been truthful about this route. It appeared that the enemy forces were concentrated in the primary search area, leaving this approach relatively unguarded. But relatively unguarded still meant potentially lethal in a country where every ridge line might conceal a sniper, and every pile of rocks could hide an improvised explosive device. Phoenix conducted a careful reconnaissance of the valley floor before committing to movement. Her survival training emphasized patience over speed, and she had learned through bitter experience that the pilot who lived longest was usually the one who took the time to think through each decision. The intelligence materials in her pack had transformed her from a simple rescue target into a high-value asset, and the operational security implications of that transformation were not lost on her. Her damaged survival radio remained stubbornly silent, its circuits too badly damaged to transmit or receive on any frequency. She was operating blind, without communication or navigation aids beyond her compass and the basic geographic knowledge she had memorized during pre-mission briefings. The nearest coalition base was approximately 15 kilometers to the southeast, but that route would take her through the most heavily contested territory in the province. An alternative presented itself as she studied the terrain from her concealed position among the rocks. A dry creek bed ran northeast through the valley, eventually connecting with the main river system that flowed past several smaller coalition outposts. It would be a longer journey, but it offered better concealment and lower probability of enemy contact. The trade-off was time. It might take her 2 or 3 days to reach friendly forces, assuming her water and energy held out. She made the decision to follow the creek bed, beginning a careful movement pattern that would have been familiar to any infantry soldier. 20 meters of low crawling, then a pause to listen and observe. Another 20 meters, another pause. The sun climbed higher, turning the rocky landscape into a furnace that sucked moisture from her body and reflected heat waves that distorted vision beyond 50 meters. By mid-afternoon, she had covered perhaps 2 kilometers, and her water situation was becoming critical. The survival kit contained purification tablets but no actual water, and the creek bed she was following had been dry for months or possibly years. Her tongue was beginning to stick to the roof of her mouth, and she could feel the early symptoms of heat exhaustion starting to affect her judgment. That was when she heard the helicopters again. This time they were different, not the heavy thrum of Pave Hawks, but the lighter, faster beat of A-64 Apache gunships conducting armed reconnaissance. They were flying a search pattern that would bring them directly over her position in less than 5 minutes, and she had to make a critical decision: remain hidden and hope they passed by, or risk exposure by attempting to signal them. Phoenix pulled out her signal mirror and began flashing a distress signal toward the approaching aircraft, gambling her life on the hope that American pilots would recognize the pattern and respond appropriately. The lead Apache pilot, Chief Warrant Officer Marcus Rattler Webb, caught the reflection in his peripheral vision and immediately called for the flight to hold position while he investigated. He had been flying combat missions in Afghanistan for 3 tours, and his survival had depended on his ability to distinguish between normal solar reflections and deliberate signals from the ground. "Viper 2, this is Viper 1, he transmitted to his wingman. "I've got possible ground signals, grid 41 SPR 1234-5678, moving to investigate." The Apache dropped to a low hover, its chin-mounted 30mm chain gun tracking potential threats, while Webb used his targeting system to zoom in on the source of the reflection. Through the thermal imaging system, he could see a single human figure prone among the rocks, moving in a deliberate pattern that suggested military training rather than hostile activity. But identification was still impossible at this range, and the area was known to be crawling with Taliban fighters who were perfectly capable of using captured American signaling equipment to lure coalition aircraft into ambushes. Webb had seen too many good pilots die from trusting the wrong signals at the wrong time. Phoenix, meanwhile, was fighting her own battle with protocol and desperation. The Apache had seen her signals and were responding, but they were maintaining a safe distance while trying to determine whether she was friend or foe. She needed to provide positive identification, but her damaged radio made normal authentication procedures impossible. She reached into her survival kit and pulled out an item that most pilots carried but hoped never to use: a VS-17 signal panel, a bright orange cloth designed to be visible from aircraft. But simply deploying the panel wouldn't be enough. Enemy forces had been known to capture and use American signaling equipment. What she needed was something that would unambiguously identify her as an American pilot, something that enemy forces couldn't replicate even if they had captured her equipment. Phoenix made a decision that violated every operational security protocol she had ever been taught but might save her life. She began spelling out letters on the ground using pieces of her equipment, arranging them in a pattern that could be read from the air. Not random letters, but something specific that only an American pilot would know: her aircraft tail number, the specific identifier of the A-10 she had been flying when she was shot down. Webb watched through his targeting system as the figure below methodically arranged what looked like equipment pieces into a recognizable pattern. When he realized what he was seeing, he felt a chill run down his spine, despite the 110-degree heat in the cockpit. "Eagle's Nest, Viper 1, he transmitted. "I think we just found Ghost Rider 2. The rescue operation shifted into high gear with the mechanical precision that had made American combat search and rescue the most effective system in military history. Within minutes of Webb's identification, every available asset in the theater was being redirected toward Phoenix's position. Pave Hawks launched from 3 different bases. F-16s established a protective cap over the area, and A-10s, Phoenix's own squadron mates, began systematic attacks on known Taliban positions throughout the valley. But speed came with risk, and the enemy forces that had been hunting Phoenix for the better part of a day were not about to let her slip away without a fight. The valley erupted in surface-to-air missile launches as Taliban fighters brought up the heavy weapons they had been holding in reserve, turning the rescue attempt into a full-scale air battle. Phoenix watched from her position on the ground as the sky above her became a kaleidoscope of aircraft, missiles, and tracer fire. Apache gunships dueled with RPG teams among the rocks, their 13 cannons chattering out streams of high-explosive rounds that turned enemy positions into clouds of dust and debris. F-16s dove from high altitude to deliver precision strikes on SAM sites, their bombs walking up the valley floor in carefully orchestrated destruction. And through it all, the Pave Hawks kept coming, their crews determined to reach the downed pilot who had somehow survived more than 12 hours in enemy territory. The lead helicopter was still 3 minutes out when Phoenix heard something that chilled her blood, the distinctive whistle of incoming mortar rounds. The Taliban had moved heavy weapons into position during the night, and they were about to turn the rescue site into a killing ground that would claim not just one downed pilot, but potentially dozens of rescue personnel. Phoenix realized with crystalline clarity that her survival was about to cost far more than her life was worth, measured in the cold arithmetic that governed combat operations. She keyed her damaged radio one more time, not knowing if anyone could hear her but needing to try. "Any station, this is Ghost Rider 2. Abort rescue attempt. I say again, abort rescue attempt. Too hot, too hot." The transmission never made it through the static and interference that plagued her damaged equipment. The rescue operation continued its inexorable approach toward what was rapidly becoming the most dangerous airspace in Afghanistan, driven by a principle that had governed American military operations since Valley Forge. No one gets left behind. Phoenix pressed herself against the rocks as the first mortar rounds began impacting around her position, their explosions sending razor-sharp fragments screaming through the air, where the rescue helicopters would soon be hovering. She had perhaps 2 minutes to do something that would either save the rescue force or get everyone killed. She began running toward the mortar positions, her survival pistol in her hand, and a plan forming in her mind that was either tactically brilliant or completely insane. The mortar position was a textbook example of Taliban tactical adaptation, a shallow pit carved into the reverse slope of a hill, invisible from the air, but positioned to rain indirect fire onto the flat ground where helicopters would be forced to land. 3 fighters worked the weapon with practiced efficiency, while a 4th served as spotter and radio operator, coordinating with other heavy weapons positions throughout the valley. Phoenix approached from the blind side, using terrain features and the noise of ongoing airstrikes to mask her movement. Her ankles still throbbed from the parachute landing, but adrenaline had burned away the pain and replaced it with the hyper-alert focus that came with mortal danger. She had 7 rounds in her pistol, and perhaps 30 seconds before the mortar crew would detect her presence. The spotter saw her first, his eyes widening as he tried to bring his AK-47 around to engage the mud-streaked apparition that had materialized from nowhere. Phoenix's first shot took him center mass, the .45 caliber round spinning him around and dropping him into the bottom of the mortar pit. Her second and third shots engaged the nearest crew member, who was fumbling for a sidearm while trying to traverse the mortar tube toward her position. The remaining 2 fighters abandoned the mortar and dove for cover, their rifle fire forcing Phoenix to roll behind a rock outcropping that provided minimal protection from their concentrated fire. AK-47 rounds sparked off stone and whined away into the valley, their distinctive crack echoing off the canyon walls and mixing with the growing roar of approaching helicopters. Phoenix realized she was pinned down with 4 rounds remaining in her pistol, and no way to advance on the remaining enemy fighters without exposing herself to lethal fire. But the mortar was still functional, and if the Taliban managed to get back to it, they could resume their indirect fire attack on the rescue helicopters that were now less than 90 seconds out. She made a decision that would have impressed her survival instructors and terrified her family. Instead of trying to fight her way to the mortar position, she began crawling toward the ammunition storage area, where wooden crates of mortar rounds were stacked beside the pit. Her plan was simple, direct, and potentially suicidal. If she couldn't capture the weapon, she would destroy it along with everyone in the immediate vicinity. The hand grenades in her survival kit were M67 fragmentary grenades with a casualty radius of 15 meters and a kill radius of 5 meters. Phoenix was approximately 8 meters from the ammunition stockpile when she pulled the pin on her first grenade and released the spoon. 4 seconds to detonation. She threw the grenade with an underhanded lob that landed it directly among the stacked mortar rounds, then pressed herself as flat as possible against the rocky ground while covering her head with her arms. The explosion was not merely loud. It was a physical force that lifted Phoenix off the ground and slammed her back down again, leaving her ears ringing and her vision blurred. The secondary explosions as mortar rounds cooked off turned the hillside into a volcanic eruption of flame and shrapnel that could be seen from orbit. When the debris stopped falling and the echoes faded, Phoenix found herself alone on a hillside that looked like the surface of the moon. The mortar position had been erased, along with the 4 Taliban fighters who had been operating it. She had eliminated a significant threat to the rescue operation, but at a cost that was only beginning to register through the shock and adrenaline. Blood was running down her face from multiple shrapnel wounds. Her left arm was numb from shoulder to fingertips, and something was definitely wrong with her hearing. But she was alive. The mortar threat was neutralized, and she could see the distinctive shapes of pave hawks approaching fast and low across the valley floor. Phoenix struggled to her feet and began signaling with her survival mirror, flashing the recognition code that would identify her as the pilot they had come to rescue. Behind her, secondary explosions continued to ripple through what remained of the Taliban weapons cache, sending smoke and flame high into the clear Afghan sky. The lead pave hawks flared into a hover over Phoenix's position, their rotor wash creating a dust storm that reduced visibility to zero, while the crew chiefs prepared to deploy their rescue specialists. But the Taliban weren't finished yet. From positions throughout the valley, small arms fire began converging on the hovering helicopters, forcing them into violent, evasive maneuvers that made precision hovering impossible. Phoenix watched her rescue attempt disintegrating into chaos as enemy fire intensified, and the helicopters were forced to break off their approach. She was within 50 meters of salvation, close enough to see the faces of the pararescue specialists in the helicopter doors, but the tactical situation made extraction impossible under current conditions. That was when she heard a sound that made her heart soar, the distinctive whine of twin General Electric TF-34 turbofans approaching fast and low. Her squadron mates were coming, and they were bringing the most effective close air support platform ever built to the fight. 2 A-10 Thunderbolt IIs swept into the valley like avenging angels, their pilots hunting for the ground fire that was threatening the rescue helicopters. Phoenix could see their nose art from her position on the hillside, Sweetheart and Bone Crusher, aircraft she had flown formation with on dozens of combat missions. The pilots would be people she knew, fellow Warthog drivers, who understood exactly what it meant to bring an A-10 home against impossible odds. The lead A-10 pilot, Captain Jennifer "Spike" Rodriguez, had been flying combat missions for 2 years and had never lost a wingman or failed to complete a rescue mission. Today was not going to be the day that record changed. Ghost Rider 2, this is Ghost Rider 4, Rodriguez transmitted on the emergency frequency, hopping against hope that Phoenix's radio might be receiving even if it couldn't transmit. If you can hear this, get ready to move fast. we're going to clear you a path." Phoenix couldn't respond, but she could see the A-10s positioning themselves for gun runs that would suppress enemy fire long enough for the rescue helicopters to complete their mission. She began moving toward the designated pickup zone, using every piece of cover available while the warthogs rolled in hot on targets throughout the valley. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon spoke with its characteristic buzzsaw roar, sending 13 depleted uranium rounds downrange at 3,900 rounds per minute. Where the cannon fire touched, Taliban positions simply ceased to exist, replaced by clouds of pulverized rock and scattered equipment. The psychological effect was as devastating as the physical destruction. Enemy fighters who had been maintaining disciplined fire positions suddenly found themselves facing the most feared weapon in the coalition inventory. The rescue helicopters used the suppressive fire to make their final approach, dropping pararescue specialists onto the hillside while maintaining protective fire with their door-mounted miniguns. Phoenix could see the PJs moving toward her position, their distinctive maroon berets identifying them as members of the elite rescue force that had made "that others may live" more than just a motto. Senior Airman Tyler Doc Morrison was the first to reach Phoenix, his medic bag already open as he assessed her injuries with the practiced efficiency that came from treating combat casualties in hostile environments. Multiple shrapnel wounds, possible concussion, definite hearing damage, but nothing immediately life-threatening if they could get her to proper medical facilities within the next hour. "Ma'am, we're going to get you out of here," Morrison shouted over the noise of helicopters and continuing explosions. "Can you walk to the bird?" Phoenix nodded, not trusting her voice to carry over the sound of battle. Together, they began moving toward the hovering Pave Hawk, its crew chief providing covering fire while the pilot held position despite continuing enemy attempts to engage the aircraft. The extraction took exactly 97 seconds from the time Morrison reached Phoenix until she was strapped into the helicopter's cabin, and the aircraft was climbing away from the valley floor. But those 97 seconds felt like hours as tracer fire continued to streak past the helicopter's windows, and the crew chiefs returned fire with everything they had. As the valley fell away beneath them, Phoenix allowed herself to believe that she might actually survive the day. The intelligence materials in her survival pack had remained secure throughout the entire ordeal, representing what would prove to be one of the most significant intelligence coups of the entire Afghan war. But more than that, she